coming. We're going to have the first talk presented by Dr. Salvador Bergel, Argentina. He's a jurist, professor of law at the University of Buenos Aires, and he is going to talk to us about the environment as a bioethical topic issue. When you wish. Hello, good afternoon. I'm going to try to give my presentation that refers to how the environment was introduced and how this affected the bioethics, environment, and then I'll talk about the relationship between the two. Environment and the interest in tackling topics related to environment has always been there. There have always been problems linked to the environment. But the dimension that exists today, I think there was a turning point that we must acknowledge. And that is the World Conference of 1970 and the document on our common future. We saw how the participants in that Congress realized the reality and the need to tackle this topic on an international level that wasn't just for one country to deal with or one area, but it was a universal problem. It was dealt with or tackled in the UN. And then following that, different regions, countries held meetings, but without any practical result to date. The greatest interest in maintaining a status quo has led us to the current situation, the increasing degradation of the environment, without seeing a positive reaction on behalf of the different fields that are working on this topic. Another important topic to be taken into account is the environment. But what was the Encyclopedia of Bioethics? Environment refers to nature, that is the surrounding medium that depicts on the technoscope to reproduce, to grow, or to develop. Bourgeois understands technocosmos, the universe that is dominated by the technical world, the expansion of the technocosmos being the dominating element. And that involves confrontation with technique, but opposition, rather, to the technique, due to interests which aren't the interests of the human being, and that is the main reason. In this declaration that of the UN of 1970, the document said that the Earth is one, but the world is not. We all depend on a biosphere to stay alive, but each country, each community fights to survive and prosper without being concerned of the effects that it has on others. Some consume the resources of the earth like routine and don't think about future generations. Many others, and many more, consume very little, hungry, poor. The dimension of the danger or the effects on animals rather, and the ecosystems due to the irrational action of human beings does not admit comparison with any previous period in mankind. We have reached a limit situation, which is irreversible. And we now have the economy, the underdeveloped economies that are imitating the economies and are also affecting all of this. The paradigm of development does not take into account the natural processes. This model still doesn't warn us that the environmental problems aren't external to the functioning of these systems, but are integrated into it insofar as the production, the development, the consumption of goods is linked to the destruction of the environment. And the cause of all of this is an actual part of it. A long list of environmental problems that have led us to be concerned with for the future due to the degradation of the soil, climate change, different types of pollution, contamination, alteration of the water level, the depletion of the ozone layer. We have to warn of the magnitude of the problems that we're going to have to face. The environmental problems aren't fantasies of the future, but are the panorama of the present day and affect the quality of life and health of human beings and all others that live in the biosphere. So bioethics must make its opinion be heard regarding the relationship between the environment and bioethics. I refer to the opinion of Garrafa, who says that traditional ethics operates on the actions of the present insofar as these are ethics that take place simultaneously. The contemporary panorama takes us to another ethics that leads to the evaluation of the consequences of human action in the future. So the topic that concerns us today, environment, plays an important role. Ecological ethics, environmental ethics. The main idea in this new type of ethical reflection on the environment leads us to forget the anthropocentric and look at a new environment that affects not just the human beings, but all living beings and the ecosystems where we live, that we form part of, the biosphere, and its complicated system that is comprised of different ecosystems. This is the main step in ethics, that the anthropocentric ethics, moving towards a biocentric ethics that takes into account life in its different manifestations, man as part of life, but also bearing in mind other inhabitants of the biosphere, the beings of the present day and in the future. This is ethics that looks towards the future. That is the main topic that relates to bioethics. Here we talk about rights. Some authors talk about rights of mankind and others about the rights of future generations in terms of the environment. Vautois, I return once again. In his encyclopedia, understands the obligations of mankind as a whole and the rights of mankind. It can't be just the rights of one community. The notion of the rights of mankind is in the environmental and international rights. When we refer to the rights of mankind, we are referring mainly to the obligation of mankind with respect to the biosphere and its members and components. This is the best way imaginable to be able to enjoy the present and future components. This is closely linked to the rights of mankind. What I want to do now is talk about the legal field which I have been involved in throughout my whole life. We can't talk about rights without having a current subject. When we talk about future generations, the subject doesn't exist. So the rights of mankind, rights of future generations are all responsibilities. The responsibility of man today with respect to the future of mankind. Mankind doesn't bring an end to their lives. It's something which is timeless, so there is a responsibility with respect to the people of the future and the present and all the living beings that comprise the biosphere. It is an expanded responsibility. We are moving clearly towards a biocentric bioethics. Life is at the center, and this includes all the beings of the biosphere, the different animal, plants. The human being is just part of the biosphere, nothing else. From the ethical viewpoint, we can't just focus on man, because that doesn't correspond to the reality that we are experiencing. There have been different authors that criticize the rights of mankind or future generations, but we must not interpret it in a formal legal terms or sense, but in a broader sense. And we consider that the responsibility of mankind today, not just with respect to those who follow us, but with respect to the biosphere and its current components, doesn't just correspond to formal legal aspects. The mankind of the future should observe a behavior that does not harm the biosphere and its components. I'm going to talk now about the relationship with bioethics. My colleague Garrafa is going to deal with this more in depth because he has much more knowledge of that, and he's a promoter of the UNESCO Declaration in 2005. And it's the main element to manage the relationship between bioethics and the environment. Bioethics arose from a series of findings in the last century that substantially changed the panorama or the composition of the ADA, the Common Ethical Code, the genetical engineering, the first organ transplant that took place in 1967, the first test tube baby. There are a series of contributions that led us to think more about the ethical side than just science, that man wasn't sufficiently prepared for this. And that gave rise to bioethics as a reflection, an updated reflection upon topics that could not be avoided. The difficulty or the charm of bioethics comes from the progress made in a field without using a map. We had to provide ethical responses that would make it possible to move forward in terms of emerging technology that would then form part of the data.
Inicialmente surgía en los países anglosajones trató de manejar la bioética o limitarla a lo puramente médico. Es decir, ahí estuvo la corriente del principalismo sustancialmente, y esto primó durante un largo periodo, y después los juristas de países, sobre todo los países latinoamericanos, empezaron a cuestionar esto. Es decir, no, la bioética no puede ser solamente el tratamiento de los temas generados por el avance de las ciencias médicas, sino que debe tener una concepción mucho más universal que comprenda temas vinculados con la salud pública y con una serie de temas, entre los cuales indudablemente debe entrar el tema medioambiental. Creo que es un documento central en esta materia, en este paso, la Declaración Universal de la UNESCO del 2005. Ya la UNESCO había sacado 2 declaraciones universales, una sobre el genoma humano y otra sobre los datos genéticos, que mostraban su preocupación un poco por los temas bioéticos, y fue prácticamente acaparando el tema de la bioética. Después se encargó a una comisión de expertos la redacción de un documento universal sobre derechos humanos y bioética que se plasmó en esta declaración del 2005. En los considerandos de la declaración del 2005, dice que la UNESCO ha de desempeñar un papel en la definición de principios universales basados en valores éticos comunes que orienten los adelantos científicos, el desarrollo tecnológico y la transformación social. Acá se ve la amplitud de propósitos, a fin de determinar los desafíos que surgen en el ámbito de la ciencia y la tecnología, teniendo en cuenta la responsabilidad de las generaciones actuales para con las venideras, y que la cuestión de bioética, que forzosamente tiene que tener una dimensión internacional,
it should be taken internationally and taken as a whole. And it also highlighted that human beings form an important component of the biosphere and play an important role in different forms of life. The objectives in Article 2, it says that we should highlight the importance of biodiversity and its preservation for the human beings to survive, both for the present and future generations. Article 17 deals with one of the objectives, says that the protection of the environment, biodiversity and biosphere. It says that we bear in mind the interconnection between human beings and other forms of life, the importance of having access to the different resources and the use and role of human beings in the protection of the environment. One of the axes is the connection between human beings and the different forms of life. There is a declaration on human rights that expresses the universal aspect, and this is a fundamental concept, and this establishes a new dimension now. It establishes a definite connection between bioethics and the environment. If the environment is typical of the bioethics and should be dealt with as such, especially with the characteristics offered today, the problems of degradation of the environments that have been referred to in the first session this morning. I think if we bear in mind the content of Article 17 and also 16, we can clearly see the anthropocentric concept, which should be ruled out and go on to a biocentric position. The biosphere, biodiversity, etc., are all biocentric expressions. In short, abandoning the anthropocentric position that existed for a long time, we now focus on the human being, placing emphasis not just on the human being, but also anything related to the biosphere and the current and future components. This is the situation of environment and bioethics today. And the declaration of 2005 is going to be discussed by my colleague later on, so I will leave that and finish here. Thank you.
Gracias. La segunda charla será
Next presentation by Svitlana Pustovit. She's a professor She works at the Department of Philosophy, and she's also president of the Association on Bioethics Ukraine. She will address philosophical basis of the environmental protection. Thank you.
Dear colleagues, the topic of my presentation is philosophical foundations of environmental protection, enough complicated object. So if we try to analyze history of philosophy, we can find different attitude, different philosophical schools which analyze nature as phenomenon. For example, in ancient philosophy is built on the primacy of nature, and a good life is conceived only in harmony with nature. But in ancient philosophy, we cannot find any idea about protection of environment. In medieval philosophy, we can find the whole concept of the inferiority of nature as a result of the fall of man. The God stands immeasurably higher than nature, and philosophers of the Renaissance reach pantheism, the identification of God and nature. And in modern time, nature first become an object of careful scientific analysis, and at the same time a field of active practical activity of man. So the main question is how to combine, how to justify the unity of human civilization, culture, and nature, because nature was traditionally in philosophy things which is opposite to society. At this slide you can see what does mean environment protection, and in my opinion we can start only from 20th century and found some interesting paradigms about nature and about protection of nature. You can see this slide some paradigms, very interesting, and we try investigate now each of these paradigm. First paradigm was proposed by academician Vernadsky, Soviet scientists, very brilliant mineralogists, crystallographer, geologists, founder of geochemistry, biochemistry, radiology. It's founder of National Academy of Science of Ukraine, and the first president was, and his idea was that biological laws don't work, and scientific search and scientific activity is a main force and evolutionary force now and the planetary phenomenon that turns the biosphere into noosphere. So very interesting and great idea, and such idea was supported by Teilhard de Chardin and Leroy. The next one, you can read some interesting ideas of Vernadsky. And critics was that this conception was enough in a position to religious understanding, and for example, it takes in account only scientific rationality, but now we have some kind of rationality, for example, hermeneutic or technical or bioethical rationality. So you can see critics of Vernadsky philosophy and conception. The next paradigm is the paradigm of deep ecology, and great contribution to the development of philosophy, ecological philosophy, was made by American philosophers and scientists. For example, Roderick Nash, in his book, The Right of Nature, A History of Environmental Ethics, analyzes the history of environmental ethics in America and writes that point that this philosophy was based on two main ideas. Nature must be protected from man, and nature has intrinsic value and the right to exist. And main idea of deep ecologists was that human beings have vital needs for spiritual growth, which go beyond such bases as food, water, housing, and shelter, to include love, play, creative expression, intimate relationship, not only with other humans, but with animals, plants, landscapes, and so on. And it was an eclectic paradigm based on Spinoza ideas and Bergson's study, liberal theory, Kantian idea of the intrinsic value, and so on. And it is critics of deep ecology paradigm. You can see such ideas. For example, very important critics that it is conflict between the rights of individual species and ecosystem, conflicts between biocentrism and ecocentrism, how to resolve this problem. The next one, it was Albert Schweitzer, very famous, great scientist and humanist, and objecting to Descartes, I think, therefore I exist, Schweitzer suggests the formula, I am a life that wants to live together with other alive being in the middle of life. Schweitzer morality reverence for life requires the preservation and improvement of life. Schweitzer morality is not a law, but also a fundamental condition for existence and development of life. And the next one, the next paradigm was proposed by Hans Jonas, German and American philosopher, and she tried to place, instead of Kantian moral law, the sense of responsibility that makes us feel aware of life. Man is responsible for saving for living beings as an end in themselves. He proposed to see responsibility as very important thing like human, like speech or like reason. And the next paradigm was proposed by ecofeminists, and the word ecofeminism arose in 1974 and associated with the name of the French researcher you can see in this slide, François de Bon. And ecofeminists suggest that women and nature find themselves in the same position, devalued and deprived of the right to self-government, and they become victims of oppression and exploitation. And one part of ecofeminism propose to consider women like example to attitude to nature, and another part were opposite to this point of view. And you can see critics of ecofeminism, some position of critics you can read. The main critics that ecofeminism is not independent philosophical doctrine, and it's like a new philosophy only for women, not for all people, and so on. And the next paradigm, it's paradigm of Van Rensselaer-Pote, founder of bioethics, the great biochemists, great bioethicists, more American bioethicists, which propose bioethics like a new morality, like bridge to the future, like a bridge between different origin of knowledge, human and native sciences. And you can see key ideas of Potter global bioethics were presented in my monography, Global Bioethics Coming into Being of Theory and Practice. And bioethics should become a science of human survival, a guide to action and new wisdom, how to use the knowledge already available and how to make it accessible to the public and so on, how to combine medical and ecological ethics. He proposed such ideas that to be happy and productive is impossible without fulfilling of the obligation of the individual to society and so on. You can see also the critics of Potter's conception. It was not enough structured to perform the applied functions, and it was like worldview mostly, not like applied ethics. And conclusion, if we try to make some conclusion, what we can say, yes, which kind of conclusion? It seems to me that we can use dialectic method. For example, one of law from this method, law of negotiation, and apply to the eco-philosophy. For example, our views about nature as opposite to the society are replaced by views where nature is humanized, has new qualities. Similarly, the society acquires new qualities of what is part of the natural community. It is the first stage of negotiation. As a second stage of negation occurs and we return to our primary object at a new stage of development. as such stage. Different philosophers were considered, as I showed you, bioethics for Porter, life as secrecy for Schweitzer, noosphere for Vernadsky, vulnerability for François de Bon, Umwelt for Jakob Uexküll, the common vote for Karl Mayer, Klaus Mayer, Michael Mayer-Abich, and etc. Thank you for attention.
Muchas gracias. La tercera.
Thanks a lot. Third presentation by Dr. Volnei Garrafa, professor at the School of Health Sciences and coordinator of the Chair UNESCO post-degree program Bioethics, University of Brasilia. He will address bioethics and the principle of environmental protection, biosphere, and biodiversity.
Good afternoon. Thanks to Sibi for the invitation. I'm going to talk about bioethics, so this and also the International Society of Bioethics. I'm going to defend the interpretation of bioethics in agreement with Potter. Potter was forgotten until 2005, more or less, when he was recovered. He was recovered after the International Association in Japan in 1998, and then in 2002 in Brasilia, the topic was bioethics and justice. It was a large congress with 62 countries, more 1,400 people. And so that was a recovery. I'm going to work on that in that area. Until 2005, the topic of this Congress on the environment didn't take into account the bioethics agenda. There are different concepts of bioethics were proposed over that time. In Potter, 1970-71, the first article, and his book in 1971, Science of Human Survival and Survival of the Planet. A broad topic. William Reich, a new discipline, which was an encyclopedia, and he defines it as a new discipline. Peter Singer considers it to be applied ethics, and I agree with that. Applied ethics started in 1960s. The ethics of business, business ethics, environmental ethics, and bioethics. Maurizio Mori, an Italian, talked about a new cultural movement. He compares it with the ecological movement of the 60s as a new cultural movement that changed ideas. Bellini, and also an Italian, has a definition that I like. He considers it to be a new territory of knowledge. We work based on a vision, the epistemologies of the South, which was anti-hegemonic bioethics that doesn't accept import of technology, and much less so from ethical passages created in other latitudes with other cultures. What comes from the outside for the peripheral countries is good, but we often need to filter what interests us and what does not interest us. Therefore, we understand bioethics as a new tool, a new instrument that enables us to come closer to reality, interpreting with greater certainty the reality, and intervene to improve so that the vulnerable ones are less vulnerable, and for the social excluded to be really included as people with universal rights. 2005, the UNESCO took 2 years to present its Universal Declaration on Bioethics and Human Rights, the UDBHR. This was the most important document, was created by 171 nations that definitely changed the international bioethics agenda. A Congress such as this should come before part of the agenda, which it wasn't part of before, and I'll explain that now. This is a poem by a Brazilian poet, Tiago de Mello. He says, "I haven't got a new path. What is new for me is the way I walk." Bioethics isn't another bioethics from 2005 on, with the UNESCO declaration. Despite many people and scientists not accepting this, bioethics changed and took on another agenda. Tom Beauchamp and James Childress, authors from the US, published the most important books, The Principles of Biomedical Ethics. Unfortunately, in the 7th edition of the book in 2003, start the book after all of this, after the UNESCO Declaration of 2005, the first line reads as follows: biomedical ethics, or bioethics. For Beauchamp and Childress, biomedical ethics is bioethics, but it is, for me, bioethics is not biomedical ethics, it is life. It is human life in the broadest sense that goes much further than the biomedical ethics. Social exclusion, illiteracy, etc. The ethics of human life, in agreement with Potter, is recuperated or recovered by the Universal Declaration on Bioethics and Human Rights. Chomsky wrote a book, Fear of Democracy, and it said that Beauchamp and Childress were the owners of bioethics, but that isn't the case. Potter was a great oncologist, a researcher. When he died, he had more than 360 papers published in the main journals in the world. He made a great effort to try to view this in a broader sense. Going through the 1980s and 1990s, Chomsky says the democratic ideal of our country, the US, is simple and honest. You are free to do what you want, providing that what you do is what we want. So bioethics for Beauchamp and Childress was discussed over a 2-year period in the UNESCO for 2 years. To work on bioethics, we need 3 essential things. To master the concepts, epistemology, fundamentation, information. Secondly, master the technique. Today, there is a master's degree in several parts of the word, and methodology of bioethics is very difficult. We professors suffer a lot because the engineering have well-defined methodologies. Bioethics, as you deal with topics, real topics, you have to work on new methodologies that are different for each problem that you deal with, and this requires a lot of work. And essentially, you need political, social training, because nothing changes without a political and social commitment. And for that, the students who study bioethics need to have the knowledge, need to understand reality, and also have social commitment. In the world, there are less and less people who have more knowledge. Today, it is anti-democratic and aren't accessible due to the high costs. The 7 million people on the planet is not accessible due to the high costs. A brief history of some international declarations. 1948, the Universal Declaration of the Human Rights. In Brazil, we're going to with 50,000 students. We've got 9,500 students, postgrad students, so we're going to carry out the 7th Congress of the Caribbean and South America on bioethics. The topic is vulnerability, the commemoration of the 70 years of this Universal Declaration of Human Rights. In 1993, an important thing occurred that Spain had something to do with. This was Federico Mayor, played a very important role within bioethics. He created the 2 committees, the IBC, the International Bioethics Committee, and the International Governmental Bioethics Committee, the IGBC, which started to discuss topics of bioethics. The first international document came out in 1997, the Universal Declaration of Human Genome. The difference between what is discovered and what is invented to determine something which is very important of the human genome. In 2003, the International Declaration on Human Genetic Data. That's our lives, that is. And then in 2005, after intense discussion, debates, and South America played a very important role. Salvador Bergel was there, Michel Jean, notable people, 14 countries from South America, a charter from Buenos Aires where we said that the countries in the southern hemisphere weren't going to accept the Universal Declaration on Bioethics. For us, it meant life and not bioethical, medical bioethics. The 19th of November, it was adopted. There is a preamble plus 28 articles, and the preamble that acknowledges that health does not only depend on developments consisting of scientific technological research, but also on psychosocial and cultural factors, as well as decisions on ethical questions in medicine, in life sciences, associated technologies, can have an impact on individuals, families, groups, or communities, and above on mankind as a whole. The first article talks about the scope of the declaration. The declaration deals with ethical questions related to medicines, life sciences, and technologies applied to human beings, bearing in mind their social, legal, and environmental dimensions. And then the principles, the human dignity, human rights, autonomy, individual responsibility. The access to health is a commercial consumer good and not a human right. For me, it's a human right. The moment that people are born, they have rights. They have rights to life, medical care. This, with all the things that exist on this planet. Article 13. Privacy, confidentiality, and the ones that are important to us, number 16, protection of future generations, and 17, protection of the environment, biosphere, and biodiversity. There are other principles, such as the ethics committees, assessment, management of risk, transnational practices, that are related to the topic of this Congress, but I don't have time to develop. Education, training, information, international cooperation, or how the NGOs that exist today, the NGO of the owner of Microsoft, what's his name? The speaker's asking. Bill Gates, that's right. 14% of the budget on health. The World Health Organization hasn't autonomy to decide on its own priorities because it's funded or financed by private companies. Gates invests $170 billion a year, but earns more than $460 billion a year in the peripheral countries. This isn't cooperation, it's a business. So we have been kidnapped. The problems of the vaccines. In 2009, for example, it is an organization that is funded by businesses. The British Medical Journal reported this. The only independent organization is the UNESCO. That is why it suffers. The US left the UNESCO. Why? Because things have to be done as I want, and if not, I'm leaving. Israel wants to leave as well. Why? Because they show independence of thought, and I'll continue. This is the Universal Declaration of Bioethics and Human Rights. It renewed, extended the international bioethics agenda of the 21st century. From the strictly biomedical, biotechnical field to the social, health, and environmental fields, reconstructed the epistemological basis that upheld bioethics, returning to the original ideas of Potter's, replaced the model with the universal reference of human rights, incorporating new theoretical categories that went beyond the biomedical field related to the four traditional principles, but without excluding them, including them, taking advantage of them. This work of Beauchamp and Childress is very good, but it isn't sufficient, doesn't solve the macro problems of the peripheral countries and the majority of people in the world. Extended and politicized the bioethical practice that advanced from the analysis, interpretation, description of conflicts and problems, and went to an applied, specific plan that was committed to people and more vulnerable populations. Article 14 referred to the environment, biosphere, and biodiversity. And this is Article 17. It says we have to bear in mind the interconnection between human beings and other forms of life, the importance of appropriate access to biological and genetical resources and their use, respect for traditional knowledge, and the role of human beings in protection of the environment, of biosphere, and biodiversity. This concept, I'm going to mention two concepts. One is a dangerous one, and the other one is racism, environmental racism. The concept of dangerous knowledge was introduced by Potter as that knowledge that was accumulated much more quickly than the sapienza, the wisdom necessary to control it. According to the Australian philosopher, Peter Siegel, sorry, there's a mistake there. The best way of working is through wisdom, producing more knowledge, and more specifically, knowledge about the actual knowledge. Here we have three very quick problems. The problem of water, droughts. In Brasilia, my country, we have springs, water. We had problems of water last year. Brazil is one of the countries that has the most water in the world, and we've got a problem of water. People wash cars, here with the agriculture, the pipes that are leaking water, air pollution. We all know the problems. I'm not going to spend time on this because we're all familiar with it. We have to control all of this better. International companies, that has been the buyer, for example, there are larger countries that are buying smaller countries, and they become conglomerates that demand more, they become richer and require more things. In Brazil, 5 people have an income over 150 million people. So why do they need so much? Environmental justice is the principles and practices that guarantee that no group of individuals, ethnic, racial, or social class groups support a disproportional amount of the negative environmental consequences of economic operations, decisions on public policies and national programs, and the absence or omission of these policies. Environmental justice can be cross-generational with respect to future generations, with priority to poor populations involving social groups regardless of their origin, and then cross-species regarding all living beings. The fundamental ethical question of global warming is who is going to suffer from the damage. They're not the rich people. There are those people who do not cause the problem. The future generations, poor populations, and non-human living beings. Brazil is the only country in the world that still has 18 indigenous groups that have not been contacted. It has 270 different languages. 2 months ago, one of the groups was contacted. These people have no idea about civilization and are now starting to suffer from the environmental impact. The Niño, for example, the water that is contaminated, people that have nothing to do with those problems are now being affected or suffer from those problems. Science, therefore, is not neutral. Scientific production is directly related to the global market. The market defines what is going to be studied and what is not. For example, peripheral countries, 90% of the clinical studies of international cooperation have nothing to do with the health problems in these companies. Malaria, dengue, for example, because these are diseases of the poor people and they don't provide wealth. Therefore, we must change the consumer customs of the richer classes because they consume too much. Environmental racism, social environmental injustice that fall upon vulnerable ethnic groups and other communities that have been discriminated due to race, origin, or color. These indigenous peoples are exposed to environmental racism. They have nothing to do with the problems, but they're going to suffer from the consequences. The environmental impacts as a result of technological advances have an impact on areas where the people do not take advantage of the results of that progress, especially the Black and indigenous population. The populations that cause the least environmental impact are the ones that are most pursued, accused of being anti-ecological. The poor people who leave rubbish in the streets, for example. Those that have larger areas of biodiversity, their territory is constantly threatened. Therefore, the Universal Declaration on Bioethics and Human Rights provided bioethics with a quality leap, advancing the individual plan to a collective plan, and having or establishing an international bioethics agenda. It went from being exclusively biomedical, biotechnological, and included topics such as the reduction of poverty, literacy, health, access to health, medical products, and environmental preservation. Bioethics, then, this new multi-cross-transdisciplinary territory of knowledge. There must be a dialogue between the different areas. It must we must have new ideas. Looking at the same object, the same subject, the abortions, for example, and look at it in a different way. A new theoretical, methodological tool that is available to improve the human rights, having an influence on national and international agendas and consolidating truly participative democracies. In conclusion, the UDBHR redefines the international bioethical agenda, reconstructs the concept of bioethics, respect to the moral plurality. We must get used to sharing with people that are different to us and not the stronger ones imposing their morality on the weaker ones. This declaration proposes new ways of addressing the discipline in each specific context where the problems occur, contextualizing them, non-coloniality. This is a concept a very interesting concept, that colonialism no longer exists. We now understand the mother state. That doesn't exist today. To the mother country is the international market, the multinational companies, and the problem is much bigger. We have worked on coloniality, which isn't the same as colonialism. Moral anti-imperialism, not importing knowledge from other latitudes which are of no interest to the latitudes where they're going to be applied. Also extending action to the social, health and environmental fields. And that's it. Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias a todos los ponentes.
Thanks a lot to all the speakers for sticking to time. It is already 2 o'clock, but we always encourage debate because that is very positive. So if you have any question, the floor is open. Many diverse topics, cultural issues have also been tackled, bioethics, ethics, etc. I will now open the floor if anyone is willing to ask a question or make a comment. Very brief, please. Firstly, congratulations to the panel members. I have a question for the 3 speakers. It is related to the national research systems. In every country, there is a national research system with some criteria, depending or on the basis of some globalized or alleged globalized policies. There are criteria, there are strategies, and there is an agenda imposed upon us. And the so famous CONACYT white papers say what we can look into or we cannot look into. And then there is another topic, identity, right? The language issue.
Fuerte la presión para que
there is more and more pressure so that millions of researchers of Spanish language have to write an article in English, which is not their mother tongue. Adding to that criteria defining topics that do not coincide with our national political agendas. So when the speaker mentions some interests that define what can be and what cannot be, that is of my concern, because the academy shuts its face regarding environmental topics. No CONACYT white paper addresses the issue of environmental racism, and that cannot be above the technological issues. I'd like speakers to talk about this topic. Unfortunately, we cannot translate because we have no audio. Yeah, with regard to scientific research, we have to take interests of the state into account. There are research topics that are not taken into account because they are not of economic interest. For example, drugs. Nowadays, the big pharmaceutical companies are working and looking into issues that can be banal. For example, tropical medicine issues are not key and they are useless. In my country, for example, Chagas disease is an endemic disease that affects whole populations, and this has not been looked into deeply because there hasn't been any national interest. So national policies should aim at that. They should aim at whatever the great capital is not looking into. A brief comment, if I may. The problem is that the research centers in different countries do not have so much power as the companies. Who defines the research agendas is the companies, the organizations, and companies move as businesses. And businesses have other agendas, different from the agendas of needs. They have positive agendas for them. They want to get a profit. That is a positive agenda. So the preferences and researches depend on economic interests, but not on the reality. The Bioethics Committee, International Bioethics Committee, has been working on big data because the big international data are defining the policies. The poor countries do not have access to those big data. Who have access? Companies and the WHO. So that is a very difficult topic. I think countries should work towards more technological independence. They should start defining their own priorities and agendas. Research at the universities is less than before, and they do much less research than they do at private companies because they don't have the money, universities. Good afternoon. Thank you very much to the three of you. Especially, I'd like to thank you because I was here at the first Congress. I remember Salvador, Bergel, and Volnei, Garrafa always touching upon this topic, the poorest, so that bioethics does not just stick to topics of the first world, as if there wasn't any other thing. And where we go back to the causes, social causes, unfairness, etc., and justice. One of the things I'd like to ask both of you is regarding the statement by Volnei saying that UNESCO is the only UNO body that is independent. Many evidences say that, that all the bodies are useful. For example, the FAO, as Tomás Esquina Alcázar said to us, who attended many congresses, high representative of a body that was born 60 years ago to eradicate hunger. And last week, the FAO acknowledges for a third consecutive year the official figures of extreme hunger are on the up. And they do not even blush. That is a UNO body. But going back to UNESCO, because you said that that is the only independent body, I remember when Federico Mayor Zaragoza, was appointed General Director of UNESCO, thanks to the fact that United States and Great Britain, who had withdrawn from funding with the former director, an African gentleman, who wanted to try to disseminate worldwide the main problems of humanity, which are the ones you are mentioning. Physical hunger, etc., etc. And however, because of different political interests, the main funders withdrew 35 or 40% of the funding of UNESCO depended on UK or Great Britain and United States. That idea of setting up an agency of news, of what you are telling us as the main concern of most of the people in Africa, Latin America, for that to be up on the news, well, that was neglected, and most of the main media bodies do not tell anything about what you are mentioning here. So thank you very much for mentioning it once again, at least for, well, addressing this issue. No? Thank you so much. Undoubtedly, UNESCO has been independent, otherwise it would not have launched this document, which was endorsed by all the nations, and later on also endorsed by the General Assembly of the United States, of United Nations, sorry. So it's almost an international agreement and not only a declaration, in my opinion. As for the FAO, yeah, of course the FAO has drafted important documents. I'm going to recall a document by Esquinas Casa, who made great efforts in terms of genetic resources and has meant an advance and progress. That's the only thing I can say. Any further question? Esquinas Alcázar.
My memory about a conference of UNESCO in 2005, when we discussed Universal Declaration on Bioethics in Moscow. There were many representatives from different countries. UNESCO paid many money for discussions, this declaration, through all the world, in Africa, in Russia, in America. I'm not sure, but I think so. But it was proposed many ideas, interesting ideas, proposition how to make wider bioethics to include ecological ethics and so on, and myself also. But no one proposition were accepted. It's like remark for, of course it's important document, Universal Declaration of Bioethics, but it's one reason that we need more, it's a reason bureaucracy, not to accept new ideas, new positions, and not to create a good declaration, perfect declaration. But it's important, of course, because it's by UNESCO, but its effect. Thank you.
Se refiere, ¿no? A mí. Bueno, sí, yo fui delegado.
Yes, I was delegate of my country, Brazil, and during all the declaration discussions. In November 2004, there were some meetings, and there was the chart that was launched later on in English, and that changed radically the agenda. 6 drafts until then had been elaborated, but that changed everything. In 2005, there were 2 meetings planned in April, 6th to the 8th of April, the first meeting of governmental experts. They were the ambassadors of the countries at UNESCO, and I was the Brazilian delegate, giving counseling to the assessor of my country. And then in April, no, sorry, it was 8th, 9th, and 10th of April, 3 days discussing the concept of bioethics, and after 3 days we did not make any advancement. But we won. Why? Because we defended that there was not one single definition for bioethics. It is bioethics, it is cultures, modalities, different things. And then the declaration was not going to introduce the concept of bioethics, and that was our point in the battle. And we thought, how are we going to elaborate a draft by June? And then we started to work with Burkina Faso, South Africa, and we proposed a commission composed by 5 countries to to elaborate another draft for June debate, because it was 0 then. We had nothing. Yes, you're right, there was another meeting in Russia, in Australia, and in Latin America. But our meeting had a very strong political position, and our country signed that position. I was there on behalf of Brazil. And then we proposed the ambassador of Uruguay to chair the commission. Roseskill was an ambassador in France. Nowadays, he is the ambassador of Uruguay in Sweden. And he was very skillful, very, very skillful, very competent. And he elaborated a draft that is what basis of what we have today for the meeting in June. And it started at 10 o'clock in the morning. We ended at 10, 11 o'clock at night. And I remember, right in the middle of the week, on Wednesday, USA wanted to have the floor to talk about Article 14, which had to do with the responsibility of health, because it was against the documents of the USA. So they had some internal debates. And then on the next day, USA accepted, after some negotiation, the terms, etc., the adjustments, and finally it was passed and approved unanimously. So it was a very democratic debate, because some people said it's not academic. No, why not? Why not? Because you were not here, because Diego Gracia was not there, or Ibishi Levishi? No, but we were there, and we're not stupid, right? I have published some works on ethics in important magazines, so we do publish in English. If you do not publish in English, they do not read you. But the document is there, and it was published. Of course, it is not legal. It is a non-binding document, but it helps countries to build up their own declarations, and then it is up to each country. That is why we need politicized bioethics. A program I coordinate at the University of Brasilia, we have 60 students, and they come in and go, and coming and go, coming in. They have another 4 years for the PhD. In our post-degree course, we focus on the Universal Declaration of Human Rights by the UNESCO. So declaration is a very useful democratic tool, and very much universalized. the way it was voted, it has a much more effect than just a mere declaration. Just as Pierre mentioned it always, declaration voted by United Nations and passed by a General Assembly is a binding declaration, and we have to maintain that. We have to stick that. It's not just a blah blah for diplomats just meeting and drafting something. No, we have to defend that. It should be a binding declaration. The very last thing.
Last question. From the moment the Spanish judge Baltasar Garzón put Pinochet, the murderer, into the prison in London, the international law started to take this all into account as part of international law. Things changed. So it started to have an international law after the imprisonment of Pinochet by Baltasar Garzón in London. Thank you very much to all of you for your commitment, your papers. Thank you, everybody. We're going to start again at 5 o'clock this afternoon. We'll see you again.